ladies and gentlemen, or I should better say, dear friends, because all of you who are still here are our friends, accompanying us to the end of this conference. And of course, the closing session, the closing plenary is the most difficult session, because now everybody asks, will all questions be answered at this conference, or do we need another one? Will the puzzles be solved? We will see in a few minutes. We have 4 very distinguished speakers here, and we started on Monday morning with the findings that we are here within old walls. The empire is over, the empire has gone, the walls are still there. Our task is to bring new thinking in these old walls, and innovation is one of the key words in this context. Innovation in the energy sector. Which technologies do we need? And which policies do we need, for example, to meet the 2050 targets? And this is, of course, related to new thinking. And I talked yesterday to Professor Erdmann from Berlin on the effects of innovation in the energy scene, in the energy markets. And he argued that in 1985, due to innovations, the energy prices dropped to an almost all-time low. But today, we already, or again, have very low energy prices. So if we now think about further innovation, will it bring down the prices even more? And will we then have a paradise of low prices? But a paradise for one country might be the hell for another country. So low prices might also be a hell for the climate. This leads finally to an additional question regarding the policies. Do we then need a very high tax? Because due to a very high tax, we could maybe improve or provide the innovations, promote the innovations even more intensified, and they also might lead to a decrease in the carbon emissions. We have now 4 views. We have first the view of the European Commission, or maybe at least of an officer of the European Commission, Pierre, and he will discuss this aspect from the EU viewpoint, EU standpoint. Next, my former colleague, Nakicenovic, Professor Nakicenovic, will discuss it from a technological and climate point of view. The role of the technologies in reducing the global carbon dioxide emissions. Georg Erdmann, I have already mentioned, an economist, will provide the view of policies for innovation and address the energy economists' point of view. And finally, on contrary maybe to the EU, Ricardo Raineri, our president, will discuss it and shed light on it from the developing countries' point of view. First presentation now by Pierre. It's a great pleasure to have you here, and we are looking now for your presentation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to try and share a few thoughts with you on where we go in terms of energy and climate over the next decades, which sounds maybe a bit over-ambitious, especially in 10 minutes, but I'll try and do my best. How does it work? I have to find it. Thank you. Well, what I'd like to do is to give you an idea of the framework which we put in place in 2008, which were our 2020 objectives, and then describe briefly what we are at the moment trying to put in place for the decade after that, 2020 to 2030, and then our vision and objectives for the middle of the century, and a few more words on where we go in terms of energy and climate from a more specifically from the innovation research point of view. The 2008 Energy and Climate Change Package, it came out 2008-2009. It's known by its nickname, 20-20-20 by 2020. So a reduction of 20% of our greenhouse gas emissions, 20% renewables, and 20% more energy efficiency, all by the same date of 2020. So it really was a legal framework to put us on a track towards a low carbon growth. And what can we say? Because we're already getting close to the objective date, we're on track. We're on track at least from the greenhouse gas emissions point of view. If you look at this, you have the emissions, the economy, and the ratio of the two. So the green one is the carbon intensity of our economy, and over the last 25 years it's been cut by a factor of 2, and that puts us on track towards our 2020 objective. If we compare us and compare ourselves with the other regions of the world, we behave in the best possible way or about, together with Japan, South Korea, and a few well-developed economies, in terms of our greenhouse gas intensity. But we are aiming at further reductions. Renewables, how do we do? Well, we're also on track towards our 2020 objective, even if renewables have a number of problems these days and years in terms of the cost, in terms of the burden of subsidies to our budgets, and in terms of their intermittency, which is asking for backup fossil fuel installations to be held online with capacity payments, public money. But still, we seem to be on track towards Renewable 2020 as well. That seems to work one time out of two. Okay. The support for renewables is increasing, and it's increasing not only in the EU, it's increasing in the rest of the world as well, in a way that, in fact, we are progressively being taken over by other regions of the world, primarily by Asia, most of that being China. But we were leading the game in the first place. We may be taken over now. The next decade, if we have plans 2020, we obviously need plans 2030 as well, because our industry needs to have some sort of visibility. We keep the same sort of structure, so a greenhouse gas objective, a renewables objective, and an energy efficiency objective, but obviously with different numbers. We are aiming at a 40% reduction of the greenhouse gas, 30% or about, actually more than 27 renewables, and probably 30% energy efficiency. And I say probably because it's still really in the making. That is a further step towards a vision for the middle of the century. It's a vision, it's a political vision, it's not set in stone yet, it doesn't have a legal value yet, but it's a reduction of our emissions by 85% compared to 1990 by the middle of this century. And it's a document which came out in 2011, which we need to revise, by the way, to make it more ambitious, to bring it in line with the Paris Agreement. It had a number of scenarios, for instance, high renewables, delayed CO2 capture and storage, no nuclear because this came after Fukushima. Anyway, what it means is that we demonstrated in 2011 that our 2050 objectives were feasible even with the technology of now, or even with the technology of 2011 in fact, and in several different ways. and in acceptable ways from the economical point of view. In all cases, renewables are more than 50%. That's one of the points which you find in all of the scenarios, but it's feasible in many different ways. If you look at this 2050 roadmap from a sectorial point of view, then you see that there's this red curve on top, which were our policies in place in 2011, a dot for our 2020 package, which was above track of the middle of the century vision, and a dot for our 2030 package, which is on track of our vision 2050. And we're actually now, as I said, doing better than the pathway to take us to our 2020. So we're actually on track of the final objective for now. From a research and innovation point of view, to support this, we have launched what we call a Deep Decarbonisation Pathway Initiative. So it is a purely research and innovation initiative. It is funded with a budget of the order of 30 million euros a year. It's a small budget, but it's only funding research and innovation to try and demonstrate what the pathways are to take us to this deep decarbonization. It looks at how we use energy and how we influence the climate from a societal point of view, from a systemic point of view. Because we know, and we've already checked, even with our 2020 package, that we need more than just a few windmills and a few solar panels and plug our good old cattle in the same old plug. We need a different system altogether, a different arrangement of things, possibly even different behaviors. And we are looking at that from a research and innovation point of view, steered by a panel of 9 personalities who are advising our Commissioner for Research and Innovation, Mr. Moitas. And they'll deliver a report by the end of next year to try and identify what's needed from a research and innovation point of view. Just 2 words on our document called Clean Energy for All Europeans, which came out early this year. It's actually the making, or a step in the making, of our 2030 objectives. Please read this. I was told that you have access to the presentations. There are too many details in there for the time that I have. But the clean energy package concentrates on greenhouse gas with the 40% objectives, and it goes into more details. It covers renewables with, again, more details. It covers the fossil fuel and capacity mechanisms that we need to cover the intermittency of the renewables. It promotes more cooperation between our member states, and it tries to put the citizen, you, me, all of us, more at the center of the action. For instance, if you have solar panels on your roof, it introduces new rules. Also, early this year, we had another document called Accelerating Clean Energy Innovation, published in January, I believe, which already in advance of our Deep Decarbonisation Pathway Initiative, tried to identify 4 areas where the research and innovation funding should be reinforced. And these 4 areas are the decarbonisation of the building stock, it's strengthening our leadership in renewables, it's affordable and integrated energy storage solutions, and it's e-mobility and from a more general point of view, sustainable transport. So it's identified the problems of the time and the possible solutions. And if you read, for instance, integrated energy storage solutions, integrated in that phrase is an indication of the societal and systemic approach that we need in order to get to our 2050 objectives. In conclusions, and maybe almost in time, what I'd say is that we, a few years ago, have come with a package, the Energy and Climate Change package, with a set of objectives for 2020. We put the legislation in place. We are on track for that. It works reasonably well. It works very well, I should say. In order to give visibility to our industrial sectors, we are in the process, together with the Parliament and the Council. The Commission is only proposing those rules. We are putting in place a legal structure for our 2030 objectives, all of that with a view of a decarbonized society by the middle of the century, which is coherent, consistent with the Paris Agreement objective. And we realize from the research and innovation point of view that we have to look at the problem from a societal and systemic point of view rather than just trying to address X, Y, Z technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Pierre, especially for keeping the time frame. And next we will hear the point of view of technology and climate, and it will be provided by my former colleague, Nebojsa Nakicenovic, Naki, and currently he is with IIASA. Naki, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Reinhard. Good afternoon, everybody. Is there a pointer? Here it is. Thank you. First of all, let me just say I'm really delighted to be back in Hofburg at the 15th conference. Wonderful environment, but in particular to see so many friends and close colleagues. Also, I would like to highlight my colleagues from the Vienna University of Technology, where I worked for decades, and it was a real pleasure to be part of that team for so many years. Now, I'll have to run because of the lack of time, and I prepared a little bit longer presentation than I will speak, so I might avoid some of the slides. But let me just say, I've been asked to say a few words about the technology, and particularly longer-term future of technology. One of the key questions for this conference was evolution or revolution. I will argue that we need both, and that might sound like a paradox, but let me just argue that for a second. And one comment on technology before I go to the presentation, and that is, if you really think about it, technology is not only about gadgets, about the institutions, about the orgware, it is about our knowledge. It's deep scientific engineering knowledge, and I would like to perhaps make a trivial observation. Knowledge is one of the territories of human activity that is truly renewable and unlimited, but it is cumulative, and that defines the characteristic of the technology. So let me start with the first slide. You might be many of you familiar with this. It's a learning curve, double log, vertically cost of a photovoltaic cell, horizontal cumulative installations. Very, very familiar, but what's unusual about this is about 20 years old curve. So as we all know, technology is deeply uncertain, but I would like to show you that it's cumulative. Let's assume, hypothetically, as in German, Gedankenexperiment, a thought experiment, you would extend this trend into the future. And so what happens if we continue installing? Well, we did, as you all know. This is the new cumulative curve of photovoltaics and other technologies. It's exactly the same trend as from the curve before, as you can see. We continued installing. Today we have 230 gigawatts roughly photovoltaics worldwide, and the cost of under $1 per watt peak, exactly what the old curve would have predicted. It's almost unbelievable how accurate that would be, despite all of the other volatilities and deep uncertainties. I just wanted to start with that. And this is, of course, incremental. This is evolutionary. Revolutionary would be replacing this by a new technology in the future. And I would argue that Paris Agreement, it's really historic agreement made 2 years ago, sets very high aspiration for all of us, warming to well below 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level, if possible 1.5. What does that imply? Very quickly, 0 emissions by the mid-century. I mean, you have to just think about it. We are 80% fossil, down to 0 by mid-century. Now, in 2 years, a lot has happened. Who knows? US might leave. We don't know. There is, as usual, lots of uncertainty. Depends on our future decisions. I would just like to comment very briefly in a minute why this is important. This is the historical climate, paleoclimate, last interglacial and glacial, 100,000 years. Mean global temperature on the Earth, you see it has varied a lot. The last glacial top was about 20,000 years ago, but something special happened over the last 10,000 years, and that is, it's the period called Holocene. Very, very, very quiet. Climate did not vary all that much. I would argue that's why we were able to develop agriculture, cities, and embark on the Neolithic revolution, and then 200 years ago, explosive industrial revolution. So climate was kind to humanity. It may not be so due to our actions, called the Anthropocene. This is the curve of the Holocene. It did not vary more than 1 degree over the period. This is the Paris range. You see how close down it is to the historical warming on the Earth. And here is from a number of studies, including IPCC assessments, systems that are threatened if we continue on this pathway. In particular, let me just highlight West Antarctic ice sheet, corals, but also alpine glaciers. We have concluded that in Austria, warming was about 2 degrees for a global 1 degree. So you have to think about it, what that really means. This is a huge, it's definitely outside of the Holocene range that I talked about. So we need to reduce the emissions. I'll go very quickly. This is a famous graph from the 5th assessment report of IPCC. On vertical, you have global temperature. On horizontal, on 2 axes, cumulative emissions of CO2 since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or middle rather. And if we just draw a curve to do 1.5 degrees, we essentially have no carbon budget left. I mean, this is a strong message. Maybe about 200 billion tons, but we emit 40 every year. For 2 degrees, we have about 800 billion tons. 800 billion tons is also not much. For example, just one quick example. It is estimated that to build the cities for other 3 billion people that will join the 3.5 that live in the cities over the next coming decades, we would need materials, infrastructure that would result in about almost 1/2 of those emissions, that just alone. And as we all know, energy is the key. So the question is, how do they do this in the various analyses? And I would just like to share with you. Technology plays an important role, but also unexpected technology, because we are so late and we are likely to exceed this budget. What people do in the analysis how to meet the Paris target is introduce so-called net negative emissions to remove the carbon from the atmosphere that was emitted too much. So to remove that what goes beyond the budget. And this is illustrated briefly here. On the horizontal to the right, you see so-called net negative emissions, removal of carbon from the atmosphere. And for the region ranging between 1.5 and 2.8 degrees on the vertical scale. Each dot is one scenario, and you can see that almost all of them are in the negative range. This is technologically a huge challenge, in particular for the energy sector. One of the measures would be afforestation. Another measure would be, for example, biomass with carbon capture and storage, technologies that we don't have scaled up. So we are counting in the future on something that we don't yet have. And therefore, the question is, can we have that like in the case of the photovoltaics? And that's the point in the next few minutes I would like to make. So let me show you how a system, thank you, Reinhard. Let me show you how a system might look like that actually meets the Paris goals. This is one of them. I will not go into detail, but the gray region is actually efficiency improvement. So we need a portfolio of energy technologies, and we need huge amount of efficiency. In particular, that would be in the end use. And the other thing that is striking about this is that we will need lots of carbon capture and storage in this kind of scenario, because fossils are still in the solution to the middle of the century. And I said we have to go down to 0, and net negative emissions. But this is not the only scenario. And apologies for going very fast. This is a scenario we did in German Council on Global Change, where we actually wanted to have let's say, a thought experiment. Can you do it without net negative emissions? Can you do it with renewables and efficiency and technologies we know? And this is how that future would look like, absolutely radical change compared to the current system. And so what technologies we would need? I would argue for this major technological revolution, we need what you could characterize as granular technologies rather than big lumpy technologies, because they can diffuse fast and you can have quicker learning curves. Part of that game will be increase in scale. Who knows, maybe future windmills will be over half a kilometer high to reduce the cost, but I also think we might have completely radically new technologies, just illustrated here. I will not go into the detail. So we need incremental improvement, evolutionary, but we also need absolutely radical new technologies. I will not even go into the infrastructure and the end use, but we really need them in order to achieve this transformation. Let me show you something that I would characterize as good news from Texas. We have enough bad news from Texas from the flooding, but also you have to say Texas is the oil and gas mecca, so it's also a cause for the climate change that they're experiencing now. But I think this is an interesting technology. It's a ZEP, zero emission natural gas power plant, and the way that's done, it's a new technology, 50 megawatt pilot plant. We are using here CO2 as a working fluid of the gas turbine, adding oxygen and methane, and the output would be CO2 and water. So it's also good for the arid areas if you have gas here. So it's not only that we need improvement in the end use, fossil technologies, efficiencies, we need a big improvement also in the renewables. So I'm coming to the conclusion, Reinhard. Let me just show you that I think as a thought experience, this is possible. It's a historical example where you see that in periods of 50 years, we did have these radical techno-economic paradigm changes in aviation, in railways, in communication, in automobiles, and industrial production. Now, none of us know what will happen in the next 50 years, but I would argue we will need fundamentally new systems because of these enormous challenges facing the humanity. And then the last slide, Reinhard, I've told this was shown here, so I show it again because it's my favorite slide, I have to say, because it shows it can be done in 13 years. This is the New York Easter Parade, as you have heard at the beginning of the conference, 1900, only horses and carts. 1913, 13 years later, only cars. And that means for us, translated, we could in many cities have only electric cars, for example, by 2030. So the revolution is possible. And let me conclude with just one remark. One thing we lost when we went from horses to cars is self-navigation. As you all know, horses can go home alone, and perhaps that we will have with the new wave of the granular electric mobility and crowd systems. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Naki. Actually, you have been too fast. You would have left 2 minutes. We have heard now the technological point of view, what can technologies bring about, and a specific focus on climate. But if we would have all these nice technologies at low costs, we would have very low prices. And this is now actually my major question to Georg Erdmann in this economic context. Maybe you can answer it at the end, or we cannot answer it. Will we have to have very high taxes to cope with these problems, or have we other solutions? Georg, it is a great pleasure that you have been here, one of our best friends and international advisors. Please.
Yeah, thank you. On this first slide, you see that I am a steering committee member of ISEF, and I'm also independent expert of this group Energie der Zukunft. And these two tasks which I have play a role in my speech. The first one is this independent expert group, and we are analyzing what is the progress of the energy transformation in Germany. And this is the result of our last report. You see, in 2015 and 2020, 2050, the emissions are still far away from the target of 2020. That means greenhouse gas emissions, we will probably not meet this target. On the other hand, we have renewable energy, and in these cases, we are very close to the target, so we will be probably successful. But if we look at the result, at the end, everything is important. We have seen Naki's speech. It's not the renewable which is important, but it is greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gas, the German example is not very successful at the moment. And of course, this is not the only country where this is the case. So the result of this is that we are looking at short term, because can we still achieve at least reduce the lack, the deficit compared to our targets for 2020 and of course also for 2030. That means the present situation of the discussion is that we look to short term and not to long term. Of course, and this is the structure of my speech, I will first show you an example of short term looking that it can also be good, and then we will discuss the long-term effect. Short term, I will take the same example as Naki, namely photovoltaics or renewables. Here you see the investment in the renewable, not the investments, the net capacity additions of different types of renewables, and you see between the year 2009 and 2013, huge photovoltaic investments took place. The result of this huge investment is that the cost for renewable energy in Germany, the support of renewable exploded, and you see here the average payment per renewable energy until 2013, it went up to 170 euros per megawatt hour, and this is definitely something which is not sustainable. So it means the costs are not sustainable. The yellow line and the red line, we have some modeling. We assume in the future the costs will go down. And the yellow line is the market price for electricity, the wholesale market price. Even if you assume a 2% price increase in the next year, you will not be competitive in the conventional sense. But the result of the German photovoltaic industry, as Naki showed us on another kind of presentation, reduced the investment cost. This is another presentation of the same figure, which comes from Prognos GWS study in 2014, and it is showing the real cost, world global average investment cost, euros per kilowatt, and the yellow is the simulation. And if you simulate this, you can find in the last years, since 2006, the progress ratio for photovoltaics is 40.3%. What does it mean? Without the German support scheme for photovoltaics, the global cost per unit of photovoltaic system would have been 2,600 euros per kilowatt instead of 2,000 euros per kilowatt, assuming that the rest of the world would not change its investment behavior if Germany would have done nothing in terms of photovoltaics. So what is the consequences as the rest of the world is investing, so it pays much less than if the German program would have not been existed. And this difference of payment, this cost advantage, is 40 billion. Germany pays, the German consumers paid 8 billion per year for supporting still photovoltaics today, and the benefit to the world is 40 billion. So this is, I think, a very nice result. So that means the investment incentive for photovoltaic was really successful in terms of helping the world to become cleaner or to reduce global emissions. The conclusion of course, we can discuss more why this same effect didn't take place in wind energy up to now and in biogas, but this would expand about the time limit of my speech. The conclusion of this is short-term energy technologies that are nearly market-ready need a strong but short political impulse. Why a short political impulse? I don't think innovation is really innovation anymore if it is continually dependent on public aid, on government aid or some kind of renewable energy. And if you assume that in the future the support for renewable energies must be phased out, then it is clear that subsidies are easier to implement than emission taxes or bans. But for helping this short-term impulse for renewable energy, but the abolishment of subsidies some days in the future is politically rather difficult, and we will see this in the next years in Europe. So this is the view of the short term. Now let us go to the long term, and I will give you an example which is also somehow Naki told us a little bit this. This is a picture, again, the example of Germany. if you expand the renewable energy system, photovoltaics and wind energy. Today it's about, you see, 2016, about 90 gigawatt installed capacity. If you add the capacity, you will not be able to use this energy except if you have storage capacity because the time inconsistency between generation and demand. And you see here, the more you go in the direction of 100% renewables, even 100% renewables, according to this figure alone, with photovoltaics and wind energy alone, according to this data which I used here, is not feasible. We need additional technology. And of course, the problem becomes it's not that the cost will be declining, Reinhard, but I think if we want to reach the Rio agreement, the cost will increase, and the intention of innovations is that the increase of these costs will not be so high, so that the society remains has the resources for other goods and services than only energy. So we need to reduce the cost of implementing Paris Agreement simply because the society wants also has other needs to be satisfied. So if you look at this 100% renewable electricity system, we need obviously new technologies, and the technology which most people assume would be the right one would be a chemical storage or something else, maybe such as high voltage direct currency lines. These are capital intensive technologies which are involved here. And the question of this is, if you have capital-intensive technologies in the market, maybe they create an economic pressure towards base load electricity supply. New nuclear? Question mark. Heat, second generation biofuels, electrical heat pumps or something else. Again, we don't know what will be the technology combination of the future. Transportation, the same thing. And I think one of the most important issues is fossil fuel owners. That means countries which have today a lot of fossil fuel in their ground. They have an economic incentive to continue extracting and using their wealth in the ground. And the problem is, this is, to my view, the argument for carbon capture and use, or maybe something else, because we have to organize a world that in the future these countries will still be able to use their wealth, but without destroying the atmosphere. So a lot of technologies came in mind, but most political programs focus on contemporary problems and not on these long-term technology questions. I have here a list of ideas, but this is obviously not complete. One of the nice projects I like very much is understanding catalysis. Can we improve the understanding of catalysts, electrolyzers, fuel cells? They all need this kind of technology. If we have a better understanding, maybe we can reduce the cost of these systems. And of course, we can reduce the materials and the rare earths which are used for these systems. In situ gasification of coal deposits, carbon-free steelworks. That is something that is very nice. From a chemical point of view, you could replace coal by CO2 by hydrogen. So make a hydrogen steelwork. It doesn't exist. I don't think that there exist even research projects about these questions. Super high voltage DC power transmission. Again, something which is a little bit CO2-free air traffic. CCS, carbon capture and use. Again, all these kind of things are not really on the focus, because our today's strategy on research and development is focused on short term and not on the long term, and that is in spite to the fact that we have to solve a long-term problem, not a short-term problem. It's not Paris is not to reach the 2020 targets at time, or the 2030 targets. Paris means 2050. So my last find is the conclusion. Today, most possible long-term innovations are still outside the mainstream research agenda and receive insufficient grants from governments and international institutions. Maybe the European Union can help here. And one of the activities which I mentioned in the beginning in my slide is this innovation for a cool or clean earth Forum ICEF in Tokyo. That is the initiative of Prime Minister Abe from Japan. And this group, which they organize every year a conference, and the idea of this conference to think exactly these long-term needs for research and development. So thank you very much.
We have really a great time management. Thank you very much, Georg. What is my major takeaway is that we have to think about the innovations for 2050, and it is important, finally, maybe in the last round, to identify what are the major policies in this context. In the first presentation in this session, we have heard the EU's ideas, the European Commission's point of view regarding innovations and how to meet the Paris targets. Now we will hear from Ricardo Raineri from Chile what could be the perspective from the developing countries' point of view. Is it contrary to that of the European Union, or could there be maybe also some good joint ventures? Ricardo, now the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Reinhard. Thank you for taking the time to stay here for so long. It has been a wonderful event. I will take a little bit a different path of what we have seen in the other presentations. I will try to make a voice for the developing world. I am Chilean guy. Italian descendant, but I grew in Chile. Chile is a country that in the 60s was one of the poorest countries in Latin America. We were founding member of IDA, the International Development Agency that provides money for the poorest countries in the world from the World Bank. But we were one of the founders in the 60s, not because we were a donor, because we were a borrower. So we received one of the first loans from IDA in the 60s. Today Chile is an OECD country. We have been growing up. We have a lot to grow. But I don't forget from where we come, the challenges that the country has faced. So I want to bring a different perspective. So the perspective of developing countries, where there is a huge disparity among developing countries. They are in different stages of development, so you will see a little bit of comments in different senses. So what are the most pressing priorities in the developing world? I would say first, in line with our event, I think the first priority for the developing world is the issue of poverty. If you look back in the early 90s, about 35% of the population in the world live under the line of poverty. We measure by the World Bank with $1.9 a day. We have done well. The world has done well in some sense. And today we have only 10% of the population that is living under the line of poverty. So 766 million are living with less than $1.9 a day. That is very small amount of money. So I would say that living with that money is just surviving. You are eating and no more than that. And on the energy side, we hear from Fatih Birol on the first day the big challenges that we still have on energy access in terms of electricity, where we have 1.2 billion people that still doesn't have access to electricity, 2.8 billion people that still cooking with biomass in a very bad manner. So there are big challenges, a very present issue for developing countries in terms of energy access, poverty. So those are among, I would say, one of the key priorities for the region. The second pressing issue for developing countries is the need of economic development, the need for growth to create jobs, and we have young people that have expectations of a better life, of rising salaries. And here we have an article that was published in a newspaper, and they comment about the ticking time bomb that we have, for example, in Africa, where today 60% of the African population is under the age of 24, 40% of the population is under the age of 14. And that people is growing, they have expectations for a better life, and that will start pressuring, and they will look for jobs. So this is a very complex issue for the developing world, that if we look what happened in Europe is a little bit different. Europe has a population that's getting very old, as many countries in Latin America, particularly the southern corner. So we face different issues, but certainly if we look at the developing world, there is a huge number of young people that is coming, and we have to prepare for that. We have to give them opportunities to be happy, to have a decent employment, and to develop and have access to energy. If we look at the case of some, I would say, a little bit more advanced developing countries, we find in general the region of Latin America that we are still going under big troubles, but in general we are doing much better. And here you can see how the percentage of population living in poverty has decreased, and we can say that today, for the first time in the history of Latin America, we have that the largest population belongs to the middle class. So their needs are very different, for example, than the needs that you have in Africa. They are middle class, very fragile, so anything that happens in the economy will bring them back to be poor again. And this is people that have expectation of rising salaries. They are demanding for better safety nets. So if you look, middle-income countries in general are facing these challenges in terms of economic development. And finally, I would say the need of increasing productivity. If you look, most developing countries, middle-income countries, they are in different stage of development, but for example, the case of middle-income countries, the case of Chile, a big challenge is how we improve productivity. And that brings us back to economic of growth 101, where we learn about the Malthus model, the Solow model, the Romer model. The Malthus model, well, is a model that people just survive, and we are condemned to survive. Then we have the Solow model, where income will grow as long as we have higher capital per capita. And finally, we have the Romer model, the endogenous growth model, where that in general apply to more advanced economies, where innovation is a key part of economic growth. So if we look the developing world, you are or in the Malthus model, or if you are lucky, you are in the Solow model. But we are not in the Romer model. Okay, so there is a big challenge how we increase productivity, and for more middle-income countries, the challenge passed through innovation, more efficient institutions, and so on. And finally, if you look at developing countries, many of them, or a large percentage of the developing countries, has a large dependence on extractive industries. One of them have a large dependence on mining. Mining is a very energy-intensive sector, so you should expect that they will continue using a lot of energy if they want to use those resources. Or you can think on other countries that are oil or gas-rich countries, and they are expecting to take advantage of the value of those resources, and if they take advantage of the value of those resources, that will imply higher emissions of CO2. And the final pressing issue that we see in developing countries is an increasing concern regarding environmental issues, where you look in middle-income countries, the environment is an issue, but if you go to very poor countries, the environment is not an issue. The environment is seen as a luxury public good that cannot be afforded. So if you go to very poor countries, we cannot talk about climate change. I need to eat. Okay, so how we take into account that view in terms of our policies? So, given these present issues for the developing countries, well, what are the key challenges that I see for the energy sector? First, growth in energy demand. We already know that up to 2040, about 40% energy will increase about 40%, and most of that increase in energy demand will come from developing countries. And that 40% is a number that is very conservative, being based on the projections that are made by the International Energy Agency, that in general has, I would say, a happy bias in terms of the expectation that they put on energy demand growth, on the potential of energy efficiency. The second challenge in terms of developing countries for the energy sector is affordability. If we are talking about energy access for the poor, certainly they don't have electricity because they cannot afford it. So how we solve the problem? What kind of environment we could build to provide affordability for those young people that are coming here? The third challenge for the energy sector is the enabling institutional and business environment. And that, I will say, is the big problem that we have in many developing countries. And finally, in the energy sector, certainly it's the social and environmental license are becoming a big issue to be solved. So what I see is a big opportunity when we think in terms of the developing world. The cost of technology is coming down. The technology today is more accessible for developing countries, so we see that there is a great opportunity to build sustainable energy system in the developing world. At the same time, we have that we haven't built so far the energy system of the developing countries, so they are not locked in a soft fossil fuel energy mix. Also, those countries have large untapped energy resources, and some of the countries are escalating up in the global rankings. And what we see that is very important is the commitment of the developing world. If the developing world commit to a low CO2 economy, certainly you will have that developing countries will follow. But it's very important the signals that developing countries receive from the developing world in terms of CO2 emissions. Okay. So thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. We will now have a last round here on the podium. So I ask the four speakers to come here and to finally discuss the major key question. In this context, I would like to ask you in the auditory to accept that we will not have from you any further questions, and the reason is if questions have not been answered so far in this conference, we will not be able to answer them in the last 5 minutes. You can ask the speakers, can send them email, or better, come to our next IAE conference, then we will start again and try to get even further. For now, I go back to Ricardo's last sentence, and it is related to the policies that will be introduced in the developed world. And the key question is, what do you, four experts, think are, from a practical policy point of view, the major activities to be set to really bring about these further innovations you have already announced in your first statement? So I start with you, Pierre. Maybe you can try to give this answer from the EU point of view, and we go up to Ricardo, and then we will close this conference.
Okay. In my view, what's required, if I go back 2015, is to take our Paris Agreement objectives very seriously. This was an international agreement which made come together the developing economies, the emerging economies, the less developed economies, us, the whole world, in a voluntary manner. Of course, we know that what's been put on the table is far from sufficient, but the agreement also has the review mechanisms in place on a regular basis to try and make those promises, commitments, better and better, stronger and stronger year after year, or rather 5 years after 5 years in this case. So if we could try and stick seriously to that, if we could on a regular basis review where we are, compare, have serious monitoring, reporting, verification mechanisms in place, then I think that we are on the right track to where we want to go.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let me just make a couple of points. I mean, I completely concur. I mean, Paris Agreement was the pivotal thing, but I think also I have to say at that time I was exceedingly optimistic. Now I'm starting to worry that science is being marginalized, that investments in that direction are being marginalized. I would also like to mention that in 2015, also at the United Nations General Assembly in September, Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. Goal number 7, which is on energy, is a key goal, and it has 3 science-based targets, which is doubling the rate of energy efficiency improvement, providing universal access to energy worldwide, and doubling the share of renewables, which is also quite significant in the way of decarbonization. So that's really important. However, I would say a few things have happened in the last 2 years, so it is not clear that we are actually on the right track anymore. So there is a big danger, in my view, that we lose time, like we lost over, I would argue, since the first energy crisis of 1973. We did lose time afterwards, and that the window for change might close. So let me just make a couple of observations. One is that, I've tried to make the point that one of the key things about developing the technology portfolio that we need, but also new lifestyles and new institutions, is learning by doing. I mean, without experimenting, we will not know what's the right way to go forward, but for that we need sustained investment. So the opposite of not investing is forgetting by not doing, and we should not forget that. I think this is a huge danger. So let me conclude by 2 numbers that might be significant. Total research and development effort in energy, which means science, technology, innovation effort, is on the order of 50 billion worldwide. 2/3 is from the private sector, 1/3 from the public sector, while the investment is about 1.3 to 1.4 trillion or 1,000 billion. These numbers might sound impressive on paper, but they are very far from what we need. Most of the analysis indicate that we need about a factor of 2 or 3 increase in R&D. And so I think this is our big challenge. If we don't do that, I don't think the transformation will be possible. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe you remember the genesis of this Paris Agreement. There was a paper of 200 pages, I think. or even long. And then the French management reduced it to 30 pages. And one idea in these 30 pages remained in this document, and this states that innovations are key. And in spite of the fact that 195 countries agreed to this agreement, including Chile, and you say it's hard to expect contributions from these countries to frontier edge innovations. So that means the Paris Agreement in terms of innovation is a very, very important document. We don't discuss this very much in the public. We always discuss the temperature increase. But this is, I think, for our question here, much more important. We have 195